Welcome to this first keynote of Culture Made in Arabia, an online conference planned and organized by Laura Saf for New York University Abu Dhabi, Clio Chavneau for Sorbonne University Abu Dhabi, and myself, Frédéric Lagrange, for CEFREPA, formerly known as CEFAS, the French Center for Research on the Arabian Peninsula. Starting today, Monday, April the 5th, this conference will span over 4 days and end on Thursday the 8th. A mid-20th century saying went like this: Cairo writes, Beirut prints, and Baghdad reads. And what went for literature applied to music, cinema, painting, sculpture, architecture, visual arts, and virtually all domains of culture from highbrow to pop. Other regions of the Arabic-speaking world were invisibilized or deemed irrelevant. The Arabian Peninsula was only thought of as the cradle of Islam, but conceived as a culturally underdeveloped entity in need of the lights of civilization brought by the traditional centers of Arab culture and their luminaries. The transition from rags to riches, as the cliche goes, in the last quarter of the late century did little to change this perception on a popular level. To an image of cultural void was simply added that of the nouveau riche's arrogance. A study of cross-representations of the Khaliji in Middle Eastern pop culture and of other Arabs in Khaliji cultural productions remain to be done, and certainly owns a lot to a feeling of something moving and a loss of centrality taking place. What has been obvious for a couple of decades, a power shift eastward, accompanied by new claims of cultural relevance, started taking place many years before. The roots of the Arabian Peninsula newly found role will be explored in the very first panel of this conference. Since the turn of the 21st century, the Arabian Peninsula has been both a major producer of cultural goods and a hub of cultural presentation, exchange, and commerce. From book fairs to highly coveted literary and translation prizes, from upscale art galleries to groundbreaking museums, from literature to music and poetry, from architecture to the preservation of traditional material and intangible heritage, culture has become an asset and a stake in the growing influence of the Arabian Peninsula in the Arabic-speaking world, for hard power always comes with its softer version. State-sponsored as well as private sector and individually driven endeavors have moved the Arabian Peninsula from the margins of contemporary Arabic culture towards the center, where it competes for prestige and soft power with the usual beacons of urban cultural hegemony, such as Egypt and the Levant. With the help of considerable capital and heavy investment in education and multimedia platforms, cultural productions are not only showcased for local consumption, but also exported throughout the Arabic-speaking world and beyond in the case of music, cinema, or literature via translation. Works of literary fiction, poetry, theater, music, cinema, television programs, and fine arts from high-end productions to commercial pop culture, thus shape a Khaliji identity in contemporary Arabic culture. This conference aims to stimulate discussion of the Arabian Peninsula as a new contender on the regional cultural scene, from state-led cultural policies to the development of a Khaliji pop culture understood both as commercial entertainment and as the grassroots cultural forms produced by local youth and by diverse migrant communities. Laura Saf, Cleo Chavneau, and myself were thrilled to receive many paper proposals for this conference. A scientific committee selected 31 speakers who will talk on 7 panels, and 3 keynote public conferences will be offered. The first is given by Tarek El Ariss today, who will be introduced by Maya Kasarwani from NYU AD. The second will be by Walter Armbrust on Wednesday, and the conclusive one by Franck Mermier on Thursday. On Tuesday, a first panel will take a historical perspective on the Arabian Peninsula's claim to cultural centrality, followed by the second panel dealing with multiculturalism, language, and identity in the region. The third panel will be devoted to music, one of the peninsula's most efficient ways of asserting its presence on the Arab cultural scene. On Wednesday, the opening panel will deal with costume and fashion as a cultural marker, and a second with art, with the Gulf as a new hub of producing, showing, and dealing art on the global scene. On Thursday, cinema and online audiovisual creation will be the topic of the first panel, followed by the conference's closing panel on literature, writing, publishing, and pricing in the Gulf. In accordance to the speaker's wishes, some of these talks will be recorded and uploaded on the CEFRPA's website and YouTube channel. I will now give the floor to Maya Sarwani to introduce my friend Tarek El Ariss, but not before thanking the NYU AD Institute for the great job that they are doing at taking care of this online event's logistics and advertising for it.
Thank you so much, Frederick. It is my pleasure to introduce also my friend, Professor Tarek El Ariss, who's a professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Comparative Literature, currently also the chair of the Middle Eastern Studies program at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. Tarek has a PhD in Comparative Literature from Cornell, and he has two wonderful books that I recommend to everyone. The first one is Trials of Arab Modernity, Literary Affects in the New Political, which was published in 2013. And his most recent book, which I think will dovetail really nicely into what he's going to share with us today, Leaks, Hacks, and Scandals, Arab Culture in the Digital Age, published by Princeton in 2019, as I said. His talk for today is entitled Arab Culture in the Gulf, From the Nahda to the Digital Age. Tarek, I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Fred. And thank you, Cleo and Laure, for this gracious invitation. I'm very happy to be with you. However, via Zoom, I would have loved to be with you in person, but we'll make do. So I'm going to do a mixture of reading and talking. I'm not going to show any slides just to keep things as interactive as possible. When the COVID-19 pandemic led to global shutdowns starting in March 2020, a new Arabic verb was born, tazawum, to zoom. This birth was not announced by a supreme council on the Arabic language in Cairo or Damascus, the traditional centers of Arabic linguistic norms, but on Twitter. Immediately, people started sharing the announcement and marveling at the translation that draws on the three-letter root, zawama. They went on applying it to other forms of communication, platforms including Skype and FaceTime. Creating this new verb generated wonder, ajab, and excitement, inspiring people to adapt more words that would fit their needs. The process involved pleasure in translation, creatively drawing on the richness of the Arabic language to play and confront the challenges of a new reality. This process of translation and adaptation in the digital age, which has given us words like wasm, tag, and taghreed, tweeting, is not new. A similar process occurred in Abbasid Baghdad in the 9th century, as well as during the Nahda, the cultural renaissance or awakening from the 19th century onward that gave rise to Arab modernity's various projects and institutions. Nahda thinkers turned to and re-edited classical texts and lexicons, such as Ibn Manzur's Lisan al-Arab, or the Arab tongue, or Fairuzabadi al-Qamus al-Muhit, Qamus, the word for dictionary now in Arabic. They turned to these lexicons to coin new words that would contain the modern. Words like mulakama, boxing, and ishtirakiya, socialism, coined by polymath Ahmad Faris al-Shidyaq, were born through this process. And just like the creators of Tazawum today, Shidyaq turned to games and poetry, drawing on the three-letter roots of the Arabic lexicons and incorporating them into his magnus opus, As-Saq ala Saq, leg over leg, which was translated by NYUAD's Arabic Library. New words meant to represent the modern concepts and phenomena, or coined simply for their peculiar sounds and musicality, unfold on pages upon pages of Ashadiaq's text. The Nahda, or the vibrant age of cultural production, was in many ways constituted through the spirit of innovation, translation, play, and performance. Looking at the Arab world today, it's easy to imagine that the spirit of play and innovation was defeated due to ongoing calamities. But in fact, the spirit survived and continues to shine in the midst of the worst crises, from war and economic collapse to pandemics. In fact, Lisan al-Arab and Al-Qamus al-Muhit and other similar sources are available and searchable online, making the task of play and innovation accessible to all. This is not to say that we are witnessing a new Nahda moment that is benefiting from social media and digital innovation, but that the Nahda itself as a process of play and wonder creation is ongoing. This has been my argument in Trials of Arab Modernity, my first book, in which I argue that the Nahda should not be understood as a historical period that has risen and fallen, but as an ongoing process, a becoming, a potentiality tied to the kind of play and performance I just mentioned. To gauge this spirit, we need to turn to those digital platforms, but also to the spaces and institutions that are enabling this play and allowing this Nahda version to continue. My argument here is that Arabic culture in the digital age is intimately tied to new centers of production, namely in the Gulf. Following the first Gulf War, there has been fundamental transformation in the meaning of Arabic culture centered around the Gulf. And here, I just want to stop and kind of give you a little historical orientation for the kind of conversation I think I'm going to have in this talk, and I imagine you're going to be having over these next few days. I mean, the first Gulf War, 1990, there is a geostrategic transformation in the region, but also it coincides with a number of transformations globally. First, you have the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. You have the advent of satellite television and gradually the internet. And you have political transformations that are really kind of making us rethink ideological divisions, but also conflicts, the role of the left, the role of the intellectual in the Arabic context that was also supposed to produce novels that were committed, engagé, iltizam. So you have an entire transformation that is technological, that is political, that is cultural, and the Gulf and Gulf institutions. I mean, I'm thinking of satellite channels, but eventually publishing presses, foundations, playing a major role, employing a lot of Arab thinkers, intellectuals now working for journals or newspapers in Lebanon, funded by the Gulf, or going through it in some way. So you have a new economy starting in 1990, starting in the 1990s, that where the Gulf is beginning to rise, as Fred Lagrange was mentioning earlier, as kind of a major player in circulating, promoting, determining cultural production in various ways. So this is very important for us to kind of keep in mind, that there is a historical shift that is geostrategic, and also that brings together, that lays the foundation for this kind of digital age that I mentioned in my book subtitle, Arab Culture in the Digital Age. So the Gulf is not simply a place or location, but is also a model of circulation and experimentation involving both local and external agents. Several generations of Egyptians, Lebanese, Palestinian, and others were either born and raised in the Gulf or worked and produced culture there. A lot of the authors I've worked on, born in Kuwait, went to school in Egypt, went back to Canada. I mean, you have this kind of in, in, in inter-Arab diasporic kind of context that is making us rethink the traditional genealogies of cultural production that we were thinking of before, Azharite training, Jesuit training via Lebanon, and so on. So these kind of genealogies to understand cultural productions have shifted as a result of these changes. To understand their work and trajectories, we need to move beyond the national and regional genealogies of cultural production, be it Egyptian or Levantine, and incorporate the Gulf into the trajectory of modern Arabic culture, starting with the Nahda. But how do we think of the Nahda today outside the institutions that Nahda thinkers and reformers built or imagined as a framework for display and performance? What does it mean now to create institutions that are not there to produce the Nahda enlightened subject within the confines of the Arab nation state that later pan-Arab discourses and practices have associated with the Nahda? What is the role of literature and the Arabic novel specifically in this context? Is it the same novel in Benedict Anderson's model that through its circulation is meant to create national consciousness and produce secular time? What is the new relation between the classical and the modern? And what are some of its modalities and implications on the relation between community and subject formation on the one hand and cultural production on the other? The Nahda. In an 1859 speech in Beirut entitled خطبة في آداب العرب, Culture of the Arabs Today, linguist and educator and school founder and translator Boutros el-Bustani hailed the founding of schools and printing presses across the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire through personal and collective initiative as bringing about the Nahda and leading to progress and refinement, taraqi. In this speech, Al-Bustani captured a moment when Arabic culture grew from the vision and freedom of individuals who came together to found schools and cultural organizations independently of government sponsorship. And here I want to quote you a little piece from Bustani's khutbah just to kind of give you a sense of this adab, what he calls adab, or what we also translate as culture, perhaps like this, the arts, adab, this kind of conglomeration of these practices that produce culture. And Bustani says, rise, get up, be aware, wake up, roll your sleeve up, your forearm of determination. Culture is standing at your doors from all sides, knocking, requesting entry into your majestic and radiant mountains, your valleys, your plains, and your deserts, which nature has decorated with lofty ornaments of beauty. Reject your sectarianism, partisanship, and personal prejudices, and outstretch your hand to shake the hand of culture. Open the doors to this old friend who is coming back to you after a long absence. Of course, here Bustani, he has 1860, the civil war in Mount Lebanon, and genocide against Christian in Mount Lebanon and Damascus. So he's confronting a political situation that will come, that he's living in. And of course, the Madrasa al-Wataniya and eventually Nafir Suriya that he's writing with the political context, the kind of sectarian divisions that he is seeing, that he's experiencing as a background for this Nahda that we need to somehow embrace to transcend these kind of sectarian divisions. To imagine, what Usama Maqdisi thinks as an ecumenical frame, to think of a way of being with the other that transcends differences and sectarian affiliations. So here, and of course here we see the Nahda as bringing back a culture that is returning after a long absence. So here, the idea of the inhitat that precedes the Nahda, the discourse that somehow there is something returning that we need to embrace. We need to prepare ourselves, create the language, create the institutions that allow us to receive that which is returned. Bustani's vision was embodied in specific curricula that shaped education across the region. In his brief statement, and these selections are from the Nahda anthology that I edited for the MLA. Bustani's was translated by Stephen Sheehy, so I just want to emphasize that. In his brief statement about Al Bayt University, which he founded in 1922, Iraqi thinker Fahmi al-Mudarris established the study of culture and the liberal arts as a core component of any modern education. He argued for the need to include the study of psychology along with that of religion, the arts along with that of the sciences, explaining the links between the latter and the benefits of their combination in producing enlightened citizens. For an articulation of Arabic culture with an emphasis on the anxiety of influence this time, centered on language and the West, I turned to Khalil Gibran and the future of the Arabic language from 1920. And this piece came out in Al-Hilal at the time, مستقبل اللغة العربية. And Gibran says, influence is a form of food that language takes in from the outside. It chews and swallows it, transforming the good in it into the language's living body, just as a tree transforms light, air, and earth into its branches, leaves, flowers, and fruits. If, however, a language lacks molars for chomping and a stomach for digesting, then the food does not merely pass through it uselessly, but is transposed into lethal poison. Here, Gibran kind of say, wait a second, let's see this West, this influence, this openness, this Nahda returning, this Nahda project and its relation to the West is also something that could kill us. And if we do not prepare for it, if we do not, build those molars that allow us to really chew on this culture that is coming, and a lot of it from the West. And then he goes on saying, they used to eat what we cooked and now we are eating what they cook. So here you have the West and the anxiety of influence and language and Arabic language as the stage where these anxieties and these kind of cultural exchanges or appropriations are taking place. While Gibran emphasized the anxiety of influence in relation to English and Western culture in general, Taha Hussein situates Egyptian culture within the trajectory of that of the West. And in مستقبل الثقافة في مصر, 1938, Taha Hussein says, we are thus violently thrusted into modern life. We are thrusted by our minds and customs and temperaments that have not differed in their core since the olden days, neither little nor much from the customs and temperaments of Europeans. And then he goes on, it is worth mentioning that ultimately I'm not making any particular call for change, for we have in fact accepted the tenets of this modern civilization since our contact with Europe at the beginning of the previous century, and the pull it has on us increases and intensifies day after day, and we can't do anything about it, nor can we stop this pull. If we were to attempt turning away from it, we would die. Here, Taha Hussein, modernity, the West, of course, like he sees this kind of common, Hellenistic tradition, especially with Egypt, talks about Alexandria and so on. But again, the way he's describing the relation to the modern one, we can think a little bit about our relation to the digital, something that we can't stop, something that we can't turn away from, which also is something that makes us rethink of this comparison between the Nahda or a certain Nahda ethos and how it is operating today. Comparing this modernity project that is centered on the West, something that creates anxiety, but also promise, and also something that perhaps is coming back today in some way. Hussein argues that Egyptian culture is tied to that of Europe, as they both share a common Hellenistic tradition. In this context, he imagines a comparative future with the Mediterranean as its site of constant crossing. But my question is, are we still in this comparative framework that Hussein mentioned? Are we turning west to understand and situate Arab culture in the digital age? And is the East-West comparative framework that he suggests and that has been in place for years still valid? And that informs, of course, I would say a lot of our practices, me as a comparatist specifically. How do we think of Arabic culture in relation to the Gulf with Asia and other Indian Ocean connection in mind, in addition to those of the Levant, Egypt, and the West? Furthermore, the advent of Nasser and the rise of Pan-Arabism in the 1950s and 60s defined and overdetermined the meaning of Arabic culture and its role in a larger state-building project. What the French Revolution did to the European Enlightenment, according to French historian Roger Chartier, 1952 and Nasser specifically did to the Nahda. His advent gave the Nahda retrospectively a telos, leading to the progressive and anti-colonial state that Nasser was embodying. The Nahda became the process that must have led to the Nasserist state, ideology, and liberation model. And the failure of this model would ultimately mean the failure of the Nahda itself. This we have seen after 1967, which was followed by the existential search for meaning and authenticity as a way to replace, if not move beyond the project of Arab modernity. Though the Nahda had multiple directions and models of the future, the nation, and the subject, these directions became integrated into a grand narrative of liberation that historian Yoav de Capua writes about, and that also determines the role of literature and its genres within this unifying narratives. And here, of course, I'm thinking, theories of iltizam, the role of the novel, from Tawfiq al-Hakim onward. So the question now is, what is retained from this association of the Nahda with Pan-Arabism in the digital age? With many Gulf-based sponsored projects and foundations seeking to strengthen and promote Arabic language and identity, what models of culture and identity specifically are being promoted in the absence of the larger national project and institutions that we associate with the Nahda? The Gulf today. The Gulf today reminds me of Egypt during the Nahda. I always give this example in my class. I tell students that when the Saint-Simonian high priest, Barthélemy Prosper Enfantin, or Père Enfantin, arrived in Egypt in 1833, he described Egypt as, I quote, the perfect setting for the next phase in world history, end of quote. Enfantin visited Egypt looking to undertake building projects for the ruler Muhammad Ali Pasha. Egypt was the place where large projects like, of course, the Suez Canal eventually got erected. Egypt was the land of opportunity for entrepreneurs, including French teachers, military experts, British doctors, Italian opera singers, and composers. They were coming to build a new opera house or factory or theater. Even Verdi's Aida was commissioned for the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. The Gulf today is in continuity with Egypt during the Nahda. And also, I'm thinking of a recent book by historian Rosie Bshir, who actually archive wars, who actually starts, first chapter in the book is about situating the Gulf in the genealogy of the Nahda. She talks about Muhammad al-Qayrawani coming from, India to Mecca, establishing schools. She talks about Rashid Rida's trip to Kuwait, and also the kind of schools that were being established there at the beginning of the 19th and early 20th century. So there is a Nahda chapter that involves the Gulf that is, I think, only beginning to be explored. But the comparison between Egypt of the Arab Renaissance and the Gulf of the digital age does not stop with attracting foreign consultants and workers to undertake grand projects, but also extends to the rethinking and the retrieval of the Arab Islamic heritage, spurring an editorial renaissance and reproducing the classics, starting with, and I'm thinking here of Muhammad Suwaidi, the Arabic Center of Geographic Literature, Irtiyad al-Afaq, and continuing with, of course, the Arabic Library at NYU, both located in Abu Dhabi. Publishers and editors, both in the Arab world and the diaspora, had to shape the production and reception of Arabic culture in the new millennium. This process is aided by the advent of new literary prizes that contribute to the decentralization of publishing. These new prizes, based primarily in the Gulf, have supplanted the cultural apparatuses of state institutions across the Arab world, suffering in many cases from lack of funding or even vision. The Arabic novel, however, no longer tells the story of the modern Arab subject building itself and the nation, moving from tradition to modernity and advancing towards a future through struggle and sacrifice, as we have read in Al-Hakim and others. Nor does Arabic poetry sings the glories of the tribe and the nation. The Arab subject and its imagined continuity across time and space is displaced and dislocated. New narrative structures corresponding to diasporic experiences or a new consciousness are emerging from these writing practices. Suffice it to read Huda Barakat's new novel, Barid al-Layl, Voices of the Lost, winner of the IPAF Prize in 2019, another Abu Dhabi-based prize, to find this dislocated, if not broken Arab subject, moving across hotels and airports, unable to construct the narrative of the self and of home, and I would also say of the nation. The advent of social media and new communication technology have altered the way people write and narrate in Arabic. For instance, Twitter, since its inception in 2006, has turned into a platform for communication and news, but also for literary performance and narration. In fact, many Arab authors and cultural organizations have taken to Twitter, recognizing its potential as a site for literary experimentation, translation, and poetry. And I'm thinking here of the site Adab, tied to the Riyadh-based foundation and includes an extensive digital library. Adab's Twitter account posts poetry and excerpts from novels that are originally in Arabic or translated from world literature. And in one example, quotation about isolation from Dostoevsky generated a series of responses, including original poetry composed by followers, paintings sourced online representing the idea involved in Dostoevsky's saying, and quotations by other Arab and word authors dealing with the same topic. Dostoevsky's quotation that was translated and posted and tweeted in Arabic created a world literary space involving live performances and literary and visual associations. The responses construct a new literary imaginary, connecting cultural traditions across languages and time periods. Twitter fulfilled a humanistic function often associated with the institution of learning or comparative literature classrooms and requires us, critics, to rethink our reading and analytical practices, to rethink what constitutes a text, what constitutes a comparative framework, what constitutes word literature, and what is the role of certain technological development, social media in thinking about these questions. This literary performance on Twitter would not have been possible without digital humanities or the process of making available books, manuscripts, and lexicons online. Literary curators and translators, but also hackers and leakers, play a major role in making available these sources online. Downloaded books and novels challenge our understanding of copyrights and the law, but also allow ideas and texts to circulate in an unprecedented fashion. Magazines and books published in Beirut, and I'll come back to Fred's point earlier, for instance, no longer need to be smuggled across national borders, as they are now easily available to a readership across the Arab world and the diaspora. Censorship, cost, and geography cannot withstand the online circulation of texts and ideas that are producing a new model of Arabic culture in the digital age. Be it Al-Asfahani's Kitab al-Aghani or even the Quran, the Arabic online sources are growing and becoming more organized and readily searchable. Even books that existed in manuscript forms with limited circulation or are tucked away in libraries at Cambridge or Harvard are now available to all and not just to experts. This availability breaks down systems of expertise, allowing individuals to access and play with the Arabic language root system to create words like tazawun. It also allows an artist or author to discover and adapt from Kitab al-Aghani or from Qazwini's Ajaib to construct a graphic novel set in a futuristic or ancient context. Digital technology is reshaping the field of Arabic literature and culture, bringing about new concepts and experiences of space and time by creating a dynamic relation between the present and the past, old and new forms of Arabic language, the classical tradition, and new writing and arts. This phenomena that was initiated during the Nahda as well, starting with Tahtawi or Shadyak, continues to this day. And scholars of Arabic and Islam, including the founders of the NYU Arabic Library, recognize the importance of this ongoing Nahda spirit enabled by contemporary resources and technologies. The availability of these texts brings this process to a whole other level of acceleration and circulation. This quantitative change involving speed, access, and searchability will lead also to a qualitative change, namely a new way of thinking of Arabic culture, language, and history. The Gulf today is attracting and enabling new Nahda agents who understand how these resources could be best used to advance and preserve Arabic culture and knowledge. But there are continuities and discontinuities with the Nahda and the evolving definition of Arabic culture and its relation to institution building and political projects. When writing, Leaks, Hacks, and Scandal, my last book, I discovered other models of subjectivity, literary performance that draw on the modern or the pre-modern or the classical in new ways. Akhbar, using akhbar, the genre of akhbar, to communicate on Twitter, but also to form communities of followers as interested in storytelling and performance as they are in news. And of course, I have a whole chapter in the book on the blogger Mushtahid, who performs the news or the scandals that he is kind of communicating to his million follower online. I mean, here there is, but people are tuning in. It's not only to see what's going on politically, because of course a lot of the public sphere, a lot of the discussion is happening on Twitter in a lot of the countries in the Gulf, but also to kind of appreciate a certain form of narration that has cliffhangers, that advertises certain events at a certain point. And of course, this we've seen already with someone like Raja As-Sani that wrote Riyadh Girls, where basically, every chapter was like an email sent on Friday. So there is this kind of mimicry happening between the literary and the digital, between forms of storytelling and narrative and the production of certain narratives. The other thing that I want to mention is also like there is a chapter in the book also called cyber raiding, where you have these kind of campaigns to to kind of in one case, one against the Saudi author Badriya al-Bishr, where you have this kind of mobilization, almost like a mobilization against her to kind of that used models of community formation and identification and reading practices, cutting up the book, the novel Hind of and the Soldiers, that was deemed, that was deemed actually sacrilegious. People were exchanging certain sections of it, pointing, the blasphemous passages. What we end up in the end are different reading practices, are different forms of mobilization that are also having implications on the way we read, we analyze text, and we understand their meaning given certain literary canon and so on. The forms of community and subject formation I discovered did not fit with the modern episteme and its cuts and its constellation of modernity, including its notion of adab and ta'dib, the role of the intellectual, the novel, schools, and all that Foucault has taught us. The role of the modern trained critic needed to engage with multiple traditions and reference, including classical genres, pre-Islamic Arabia, hadith, popular culture, and so on. And this is where, I want to say that all of a sudden, something about our training is become, as modernists, let's say, or classicists, becomes insufficient, becomes insufficient to account for, to engage with these new forms of cultural productions that are requiring forms of interdisciplinarity and forms of engagements that require us to go back to school and learn and discover and enter and search new texts, discover new traditions in order to try to make sense of the scene that is unfolding in front of us. So all of a sudden, the whole idea of the epistemic break that Foucault theorizes, the advent of modernity, requires us now to rethink of this relation between the present and the past, and to rethink also forms of disciplinary formations and expertise that have been built around these divisions. Are we returning to the classical the way the Nahda did? Or is the classical also, in some cases, the phantasmatic, that's made up of, jinn appearing on Twitter and tribal mobilization working as campaigns to either silence authors or what have you? Are they not, are we returning to the classical not to kind of prepare, as Bustani was saying, to prepare the ground for the modern, or to build the novel or to create the kind of literary works that would tell the story of the subject and the nation? The demand for the classical, the comparative reading that no longer tolerates the separation for the modern and the classical, that wants to do away with the modern as an epistemic break, is full of possibilities to rethink literary canons, but also political systems. The fear, however, is the return of Orientalist discourses and practices, that in the name of the critique of an anti-colonial, liberationist modernity tied with 50s and 60s projects and utopias, if I may say, that the critique of this modernity might reenact forms of expertise that exclude the native that Chidiac defended in his critique of British and French Orientalists in the 1850s in Europe. This is, of course, what Edward Said, of course, warned us against as well. Thus, it is essential to think carefully about how this new dialogue between the classical and the modern is done, and to find ways not to fetishize tradition or treat it as origin and cultural high point that is served to legitimize current political discourses. To avoid this, new critical practices are needed, ones that deconstruct Egypt and the Levant as the centers of Arabic culture, one that rigorously and critically engages with Gulf culture, culture made in Arabia, as the conference is entitled. One final thought on language. The new media today are allowing forms of writing that are also colloquial, that are bringing back the Nabati and the Amazigh and the various languages and imagined communities that were stifled by the nation state and its centralized councils and presses. So if the Nahda became associated with the language project primarily, to go back to, Germanus Farhat in the 18th century, but of course to Bustani as well, preparing to contain the modern. Where are we today from this language project? There is a discourse on language protection and revival today, but what does it mean in a post-national context? Is Arabic entering the museum as a relic of a cultural and political community that is no longer present? Or is Arabic preparing itself to contain something that has moved beyond the modern moment or project of modernity that is tied to, modern standard Arabic, the nation state, and a liberal European ideal that Taha Hussein and others were either embracing or warning against? And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tarek, for this very rich talk. I was taking so many notes. Hopefully I'll be articulate. I want to say again, please, to all the attendees, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A so that I can find them in one place. I'm going to start by just chatting with Tarek a bit, and then I'll turn to the Q&A. Tarek, where do I begin? I am a big fan of the weirdness of the Nahda. So I'm happy to see you thinking about how we can trace these continuities into the present. And I guess my first question would be, what do we gain from this continuity? So, teleologically, as you say, the Nahda ends in 1952. There's a certain failure, and then post 1967, there's a bigger failure and a turn inward. And it's supposedly this kind of a rupture, which I don't agree with. And I like what you're suggesting in putting forward a continuity that will help us think about how culture is actually made in the Arab world and then in Arabia. So I was wondering if you can start by telling me a little bit about what we gain by that. And then the second question related to it is, what do we gain by retrospectively then injecting the Gulf in that narrative?
I think, the way I see the Nahda is really, what I'm saying is that there are continuities and discontinuities. Mm-hmm. Because the Nahda also has been overdetermined. It has been, it has come to mean something that maybe the Nahda has nothing to do with it. The Nahda is also up for grabs. The Nahda is not some fixed project that has risen and fallen, with the military debacles of 67 or some other defeat. So the Nahda became associated with the rise and fall of a certain utopia of an Arab nation state that probably never really took off the ground. I mean, of course, you have a lot of achievements and so on. I'm not berating that. But I'm just saying that there was a danger in associating the Nahda with a particular liberationist nation, model of the nation that we have not achieved. And this is a reality. Politically, we are not there. So what do you do? And does this lack of attainment of this kind of liberal political ideal, does it cast the Nahda as a failure, as a failure? And this is where I'm, it's these 2 points. I want to exist or theorize in between these 2 points, because we can't. So what I'm trying to say is that there are certain models of Nahda practices and Nahda spirit or innovations or that continues, that are ongoing. This is what I mean by trials, that are always that continue somehow. But at the same time, they continue, and what we need to do is to also, we cannot just simply look at them on their own as kind of standalone practices. Mm-hmm. We also need to ask the question of what literary canons, what political models are these, practices also contributing to? And what is the role of the institution? Because, when we think of Boutros al-Bustani's Madrasa al-Wataniya and Nafir Suriya, it's like a response to 1860. There is a response to a very specific political context where you're trying to create these institutions that that produce some national subject in one way or another. So what I want to say is that what are the roles of the institutions today? Are there what kind of visions uh, are there today to kind of think what notions of the future? I mean, again, one of the key points in the question of the mustaqbal, right? The mustaqbal in Taha Hussein, in the idea of the future, but also in Gibran, mustaqbal lugha al-arabiyya, mustaqbal thaqafa fi Masr. But these futures are based on a certain, you know, narrative of where we come from and where we're going. So for my questions today for these, Nahda practices is what understandings of the future are they producing or would they produce? And this is very important because before, we were in a certain teleology that, imagined a certain Arab future, Nasserist or otherwise, liberationist, defeating colonialism, and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that what kind of models of the future are we occupying? And of course, there is a lot of work, especially our artist colleagues, on the question of future and futurism, especially in the Gulf. And so the Gulf's role in kind of, or the Gulf as a place, not simply, I'm not thinking of the Gulf necessarily as a kind of a nation state or a kind of clearly defined political formation, but also as this kind of space that gives rise to models of futurity that also have implications on the kind of arts and culture that is being produced.
Thank you. Again, a lot of food for thought. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll go to the Q&A. So you seem to be talking about two performances of the digital in the Gulf. One that is associated with institutions like NYU Abu Dhabi, and one that is happening online in that different sphere, which also encompasses other Arab countries, right? So where these writers, or even just the readers, are coming together to form new communities. In your opinion, how do these two digital cultures, so to speak, contribute to challenging the expertise and to producing this new critic or new writer that you're imagining, coming out of this necessary necessary cultural presence of the Gulf, which I agree with. But how do we see these two together as digital practices, informing one another, perhaps, or not?
Yeah. See, one of my arguments in the book is that our secure place as experts, as readers of text who generate meaning, who interpret, who analyze, who investigate. I mean, even look at the language that we use to, to construct our expertise that have power over the text. I mean, I challenge that power.
Yeah.
I think making, Lisan al-Arab searchable or making Kitab al-Aghani searchable, it's not only me overcoming nature, like the Saint Simonian model that again Nasserist, taming the nature, building a dam, reaching the, kind of breaking and constructing a canal. So this kind of the power, my power as an expert, as an agent that has power over text and over nature, over the object. This is very important. That power is undermined. And I think we need to acknowledge that, because I also, when I'm opening Kitab al-Aghani, I'm sucked into it. And there is something about its order, its conceptualization of time and reality and language that is also coming and affecting me and overcoming me. So there is something also about our pretenses to control, to, where technology is used simply as something that we can control. That's why, one of the arguments in the book is the leaking subject, right? Like there is not, there is something that we cannot control. There is forms of information, knowledge production that is out of our control. That is also something that is imposing its own logic on us. And therefore, and that's why I say we're no longer simply in the kind of Orientalist knowledge production where I'm just simply kind of preserving these texts and making sure they survive. But there is also another form of, I don't know, pre-modern, the classical, I call it also the archaic in some cases, that its logic is coming and its aesthetic logic, its logic of identification is coming and also pulling me, and not just me as an expert, but also these new community formations that I think are happening at multiple levels, including online, where they're being interpolated in ways that are different from the interpolation of those Foucauldian institutions, the prison, the school, which are part of this kind of modern project that has influenced the way we think about Arab culture. Because we're thinking about Arab culture in the modern age, at least. So, and that also is forcing us to rethink the relation between the past and the present. What historical trajectory needs to be rethought? It is no longer the teleological trajectory of the Arab subject reaching progress and taraqi and becoming kind of at the same footing as that of the Western subject, right? That Gibran was very, calling an alarm about. So what I'm saying is that there is also something about this past in its various manifestations, in terms of writing, in terms of fantasy, in terms of belief, that is also coming to intervene and to pull us into those spaces. So I can, of course, preserve and translate, but there is also something else that is going on. My control, and the problem that I see is that, to what extent these acts of preservation might fix things, might make fetishize something about Arabic culture and how great it is, and look at our past and look at our language and how fantastic it is. That is a very dangerous also moment. So my interest is how to train a different reading public that is able to handle these pulls without fetishizing, without putting Arabic culture and language in a museum. You see? So this is really the point. How do we train and come up with curricula and classes and conferences like this one that is trying to kind of deconstruct the way certain cultural narratives have been produced, the way certain canonical formation have come to be, by bringing in certain things that have been rendered, as Fred said earlier, invisible, have been invisibilized or have been kind of excluded from the narrative.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I have many more questions, but I'm going to actually allow other people to ask questions. But it is remarkable. And one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking is perhaps the nature of the digital, because it allows revision within its form, would be one way to think about not fetishizing, or at least pulling people away from a fetishizing of a singular object, and a recognition of the revisionary power of editing and reposting and retweeting, and this possibility. Maybe that's one way to think about it. So okay, I'm gonna start with the questions. You can also see them, Tarek. I think if you click on Q&A, that might make it easier for you, but I will read them for you. So a question from Lucius, one of our students at NYU Abu Dhabi. He asks you, especially in regards to Nasser, how do we understand the inevitable conflicts between culture and the state that ostensibly seems to support it? Lebanese historian Charles El Hayek argues that Nasser actually killed Egypt's cultural potential and prominence through his suppression of the press, pluralism, and free culture expression. Can't we also see a connection between this Nasserite censorship and the political policies of current Gulf governments?
Uh, Definitely, absolutely, very good question. Um, but also, I think, Nasser, uh, I'm thinking Nasser, there is not what Nasser was to Egypt and also what Nasser was to the Ummah, the Arab world in general, and also I would say to the global South more, even, at a larger scale. So there are these, two levels where Nasser, and of course we think of Burj Al Qahira, the radio, the control of the media. There is Nasser that, my colleague at Dartmouth, Jonathan Smolin, is writing on Hassan Abdul Quddus and Nasser and Rosal Youssef, this kind of like back and forth, this tug between the journalist, the intellectual, trying to speak truth to power, but being, disciplined and punished by the Zaim, by the ruler. Definitely you have this, but also you have, I mean, there is something also about, the digital that, I mean, definitely you have censorship, but also you have forms of circulation that are, in my opinion, very hard to control. I mean, you can, not that I don't want to like, I don't want to say that we're living in more liberal or open times. I mean, this is not what I want to say, but there is definitely a kind of the grip of forms of censorship and centralization is also not what it used to be at the time of Nasser. There is obviously a kind of a political, there is a technological transformation that allows more leakage, that allows more slippage, and that is important. Of course, we see and like in certain places where there was the state learned how to hack the hackers, learned the language of those hackers that were trying to push their political agenda, that were trying to expose certain violations and so on. And of course, so it's a kind of it's an arms race between the activists and the state, and then and of course the state is, you have electronic armies now that are there to control, to harass, to silence forms of expression that we normally thought of just simply as kind of physical power. I mean, there is also physical manifestation of the power of the state, but also there is now, a digital one as well. So definitely, I do think that there is, the comparison is valid with these kind of transformations that we are having today that might differ or that might create different spaces of confrontation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wafa asks you, why is Arabic unable to Arabize up-to-date words, as in English? So she gives the example of Zam, Tazawum, Yazum, but what about Skype, WebEx? I guess the question is, are some terms more open to ishtiqa and, like, or is it the use value? What is it that makes them more amenable to adaptation?
I mean, I think what I'm I started with this as a kind of a play, as a game, not necessarily as a kind of a rigorous translation project that's trying to capture a fundamental concept in the work of some author. I mean, obviously, there is humor here. There is play that I think also is important, and I like that people, where we're just having fun with this in the midst of a lockdown. And this is where I think, we need to keep in mind, and this is very Shidyak, in my mind, where there is also a pleasure in kind of, doing these things. And of course, certain words lend themselves more than others, but also you have, words that I mentioned, like wasm, tahri, they're not just simply uh, using ishtiqaq, but they're also kind of trying to capture something about the phenomenon that we are seeing in the digital space. But I think it's the play that I find interesting here, so I think that's very important, and that continues.
Absolutely. Speaking of play, that leads well to Hisham's question, um, where he says 60% of people in the Gulf are already digital natives, right? And I think he's asking, is this availability of new content, but also this availability, perhaps we can call it, of a new expertise, right? The digital natives. Is that what is enabling and empowering the digital native to be liberated and creative in content making and remaking and dissemination, which is, I think, something close to your heart in your own books, that potential new subjectivity.
Exactly. Exactly. And this is really, this is the possibilities. This is the beautiful possibilities of this time. I mean, of course, there is something very uncertain because we're outside of the kind of traditional models or narratives of state and nation and novel and the role of literature and the arts and iltizam. We've been pushed outside of them. I mean, a lot of regimes have kind of shot themselves in the foot that they started using them so gratuitously that they stopped meaning anything. That these narratives of power have kind of delegitimized themselves. But I think Hisham is absolutely right in the sense that there is a new forms of subjectivity, because I think how do we and subjectivity is a narrative of the self. It's how we imagine, it's a story we tell of ourselves in relation to power, to the sovereign, but also to others. It's psychology is one narrative of the self, the psyche is one narrative of the self. And I think this is what's fascinating to discover, is that we're entering in a new terrain, because again I go back to this role of experts, because you know at least I mean, I grew up in Beirut, right, during the Civil War. So this is, we had to learn, we had to enter into these discourses and learn. And if you see a lot of Arab intellectuals, authors who go on Twitter, and I've written about those actually, imagining that somehow you're going to recreate a public sphere or the cafes in Beirut or in Cairo and just kind of continue that conversation just by going online, they are completely disappointed. And they've written books about this. Abdul Ghazzami wrote this fantastic book called Thaqafat Twitter, which is like a manual, but also an explanation, but also a kind of a manifesto for Twitter adab, civility. So again, I think there is definitely a generational difference that is also liberating, that is pointing to new forms of subjectivity that could no longer fit into our theories of development or state building, or even, I would say, and this is what I try to point at in the talk, comparative literature. Even the West is no longer centralized or centered, as a kind of as a place of influence. And of course, this is the story of the Nahda, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, as this kind of, grand moment in 1798 that somehow has spurred and shaped in one way or another, the Arab response or so on. So I feel like here we have truly tamed and incorporated and translated this modern technology. We're not just simply using Western tools. And this is, I think, what's very important. And the whole idea of Western agents and so on, and mimicking the West and imitating the West, like that whole discourse of forms of takhween, of forms of exclusion that somehow you're breaking with a certain tradition or kind of authentic regional cultural space, that model is no longer viable. Like we've with the amount of people that are using these new media, I mean, it is no longer of the West. It is also something that we have also incorporated. It's become ours, and we're redefining it, and we're using it in ways that probably is not used in other places of the world. So it is not monolithic. It is not just simply a machine that has the same function in every context. So it is redefined in the usage itself with the cultural influences and context, and the possibilities that it creates for you to imagine yourself as a subject and project yourself into the future.
Um, this ties into also nicely to May's question, which is really about particular examples of new forms of Arabic that capture the gist of these new practices that you're talking about, the breaking with older forms of the Nahda and the Nation and MSA. So perhaps some examples. She also thanks you, as I do, for a really great presentation.
Yeah, I mean, also what we need to think about is that all of a sudden we are writing, not speaking, writing dialects, we're writing colloquials, we are writing at an unprecedented level. And that is linguistic production, that is written, that is record, you know? It is no longer something that, it's no longer, these languages or these tongues, Elson, are not just simply there for, like, buying your stuff from the souk, or something. These are now coming into the cultural scene and making us rethink of the standardizations that we've been practicing, that we've been building, but we've been building with this idea of tamaddun and taraqqi and all these kind of, that are supposed to make us more legible to the West, ultimately, right? I mean, that are making us more closer to a certain ideal of modernity and civilization. So there is also now a kind of a, I think these new technologies have opened up. I mean, we're writing at an unprecedented rate. I mean, to come back to again the idea of, Egypt writes, Beirut publishes, Iraq reads. I mean, again, I think everyone is writing right now, and that is not just simply, that is affecting the way we think. I mean, language is the most fundamental component of the way we imagine ourselves, of the way we relate, of the way we fantasize, and so. And the language we are using to write and the expressions and so on are having a tremendous effect on what we consider to be lugha mu'addaba or an adib or all these kind of disciplinary models that we've had to deal with because of various councils and state projects and so on. So there is something that needs to be acknowledged, that needs to be studied, that needs to be, recognized about this, these multiple voices and forms of, and language means.
Especially that they challenge, as you kept saying, the nation state, right? So now we're seeing resonances and formations of communities that in some cases insist on their own national belonging, but the way that they use these forms challenges that, even if they intended. And I think this is what I find so fascinating in what's happening online. It's happening despite the subject's agency, let's put it that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is why I come back to, being humble about our own expertise
Yeah.
and our own intentions.
Yes.
I mean, the first thing you study in the complete training I have is that, the author's intention. Just put it aside. And it's true because the effects of these forms of cultural production, writing, and so on, their effects no longer correspond to maybe the intention of certain nationalist, background or what have you. They are having other effects, and
Yes.
this, in a way, makes us harder. It makes it harder for us to study them, but also we need to study them. We need to, if we need to kind of evaluate them, assess their effects, and see where they are taking us. And I think we really need to come up with theories. We need to come up with understandings that kind of break with our expectations, because our expectations all of a sudden are not are this is what Thomas Kuhn talks about with the paradigm shift, right? Like there is, all of a sudden your theories don't work
Yeah.
to produce the kind of meaning that you need to understand the phenomenon. So there is a moment when you say, okay, it didn't work here, it didn't work here, it didn't work here. I need to really push myself to develop new models of interpretation that come closer to this kind of reality that I'm observing.
Mhm.
And that required that we become students ourselves. We, the experts, become students ourselves.
I agree. And what a beautiful thing to become students ourselves. I'll continue with the questions before we run out of time. They all relate really well, which is testimony to your talk, Tariq. So we have two questions from anonymous attendee, but they link together, so I'm going to pull them together. One has something related to what I had asked you before of do you think the digital age is going to blur the boundaries between popular culture and scholarly culture? And then related to that, how do you see the place of Arab intellectuals in the current period? Is that a potential limit to the comparison with the Nahda?
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, I think so. So the first question, absolutely. I mean, the digital age. I mean, I don't want to say again. I don't want to. I keep kind of wanting to remind myself and the audience that I don't want to set the digital age as this kind of great emancipatory, you know, framework where all of a sudden, subversion can happen and new potential can be actualized. So I always want to start by warning that against this. But definitely there is the canon formations, or what constitute high art and low art, like all these kind of um, normative norms of evaluation and understanding and so on are being challenged fundamentally. And we are required, and you have a lot of people who even colleagues, even myself, who are engaged in different kinds of conversations that are within the academic context and outside of it as well. And I think this is something very important and very healthy. And that links to the question about the intellectual. And of course, this is a big question, and I've tried to address it in the book. Is that this notion of المثقف والسلطة, or the role of the intellectual, the role of the novel in in kind of producing as a vehicle for creating political consciousness, or a form of to enlighten people and make them become aware of their political plight and then mobilize in certain ways. Of course, I wrote a book arguing that there are different forms of creating consciousness that are not through the novel as a bildung, but are also through YouTube channels that put videos of abuse in prisons and so on. It's through fath, it's through forms of exposure that overwhelm, that that have affective repercussions, that are not just simply working on enlightening, on creating. And this is very important. I mean, I also worked on 18th century France, so this kind of tradition of creating the enlightened subject, through forms of realizations, through. And of course, recently, there is a Tom Brennan's uh, biography of Edward Said, talking about Edward Said's writing a novel, but then deciding that the novel is probably not the best way to communicate or to enact his political project. So he went back to being an activist critic. So it's very interesting, because we are also dealing with various forms of activisms and critique of power that are taking different shapes. I mean, in the book I talk about uh, fath as a practice of critique of power, as a practice also of last resort. So it is no longer this constellation of the op-ed, in the newspaper, that is the kind of Zola moment, in the Dreyfus affair, the J'accuse moment, where that is meant to somehow uh, bring to light something that has been made invisible. Now we have all these other practices of bringing things to light. So definitely there is that manzuma, that constellation of the intellectual, the novel, power, critique of power. That whole constellation is appended. And we are dealing with different forms of the connections, and they're all integral, and they're all integral also to this narrative of the subject, of this kind of subject that is meant to demand its rights, require privacy, that is imagined in a certain model, utopian perhaps, but model, liberal state, nation state model, with all its means of writing and expression, and critiquing power and demanding its rights and so
Um, Related to that, I'll jump to Leticia's question and go back to Fauzia's as we end, because Leticia's question is about the short story. She's asking, does the short story then now come to substitute the novel? Is the novel no more functional in a post-national era if this is what we're in?
Well, it's no longer functional the way we have theorized it to be within a particular canon of modern Arabic literary criticism. So it is no longer functional in that sense. I mean, I think that's why I gave an example of Huda Barakat's novel, which is made of 6 letters that never reached their addressee. Of course, here we can think of, the purloined letter in Lacan. We can think of, because what does it mean that the text doesn't reach its addressee? What does it mean when the text doesn't reach its audience? And what kind of audience is the audience that is reading? And of course, the short story, poetry. I mean, there are other literary expressions, and also, like, let's also think. And for me, this is very important. It's also what we can read, also questions of attention span, the forms of circulation, what is posted. I mean, again, you have now essays, articles that say this is a 4-minute read, this is a 6-minute read. And this is not new. I mean, Jahiz, was aware of this, and would, in Kitab al-Hayawan, would stop at some point and say, okay, I've been talking too much about pigeons, so now I'm going to entertain you with some jokes, because I know I'm demanding a lot of you. So take a break. So this is, again, it's old new, but definitely I think the novel as being integral to a certain narrative of progress towards liberation, towards salvation, especially in the global south, in a kind of a colonial or post-colonial context. That role is no longer being played by the novel. And it doesn't mean that the novel, obviously, we're still like, I mean, look at the prizes. Everyone gets excited at the novel, who's going to win, who's shortlisted, who's longlisted. Even us, we tweet and circulate these lists, regardless of our critiques, right? Regardless of our critiques of prize culture, or it's all of that. But there is some currency in that, and the novel obviously has not, is not gone. It's still present, but maybe it means something else, and we need to read it given different parameters.
Absolutely. Um, we have time for one more question, although really, Tariq, I might find you later and continue this conversation if you don't mind. Fauzia asks you, and I think it's a good way to end and sort of tie things together. She's wondering whether the development of culture in the Gulf region needs, especially to modernize also family laws and political power, if it is going to pioneer or be leading this new version of quote unquote modernity. And then what would your thoughts on that be?
I think Fauzia is absolutely correct, because culture is always tied to law, politics in some way, or the kind of imagined community that we think we are part of, or we are contributing to. I mean, I think, one of the things I wanted to say also about the Gulf is that it's creating these novel forms of communities where the people who are producing culture might be, they're not necessarily, citizens, carrying passports of certain countries. So there is already this space that is allowing for certain forms of circulation, movement, participation. You go in, you go out, you contribute. Things refract in multiple ways. But I definitely think there has to be an eye on the political at all times, because also censorship is not just simply people preventing you from speaking. Censorship is when you think you cannot speak, is also when you also censor your own thoughts. And this is really the big danger, is self-censorship, is also what we think is internalizing forms of censorship, or internalizing lack of certain political rights or freedoms that have become essential to us to create new literature, to create new art, to also be able to discuss them in a way that is open and interesting and free of those anxieties and fears that weigh on us. So of course we need to always, push for these changes, to make sure that these changes are, and to what extent that is going, we're heading in that direction or not, I'm not sure. To what extent is this new scene of cultural production that I'm describing is tied to some grander liberationist project that will continue to support and sustain the free thinking subject? I'm not sure. Does that mean that we're heading towards a more, dictatorial or despotic system of thought? Also, that belongs to my old theories of dictatorship and democracy. That also, so I really have to work very hard to try to envision what, what is coming, or where we are heading, and how the political is necessary to preserve, sustain certain freedom of thought and cultural production. Um, so the jury is out on this, but I think it is necessary to keep this as part of the debate.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tariq, for a wonderful talk and a great discussion.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you very much.
And yes, thank you to both of you. This was a beautiful opening for the conference, and we will be meeting tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for the first panel. Thank you again to all of you, and thank you to the New York University in Abu Dhabi Institute for organizing this conference.